an apartment building in a troubled neighborhood of Milwaukee. From the ventilation system in Glenda Cleveland's apartment, the sound of a chainsaw and a horrific smell once again fill the air. Next door, young Jeffrey Dahmer calmly washes blood-stained tools under the tap while sipping canned beer before heading out for a stroll. In the hallway, Glenda once again complains to the young man about the smell, and he explains it as spoiled meat, promising to fix it. But he had said the same thing a week ago, and before that, throughout the entire time he's lived there. The neighborhood is plastered with flyers about missing young men. As Jeffrey passes by, he enters his favorite club, where he spends every free evening. After partying, the blonde man invites another friend over to his place, promising him some money for participating in a photo shoot. But as soon as the men enter the apartment, Tracy feels uneasy and tries to leave. Nothing works. Jeffrey insists that his friend stay and offers him poison beer, then sits him down to watch a movie, holding a cleaver as a convincing argument. Once his guest is out cold, Dahmer presses his ear to his heart, wanting to hear its beat before eating it. Realizing that he is unlikely to escape, Tracy tries to lull his friend's vigilance by feigning obedience and agreement to everything. It is this that helps him escape from the cursed apartment. In an alley, Tracy stops a police car and tries to tell them what happened, but a black man usually doesn't inspire much trust in the cops. They nevertheless agree to check the address, where they accidentally discover evidence of horrific crimes. Lionel Dahmer is awakened by a phone call, and the old man rushes to the station. From the detectives, Jeffrey's father learns that his son did not just take the lives of young men. He did so in a twisted manner, involving close relationships and even eating some of his friends. Jeffrey is brought to the station and after formal procedures is taken for the first interrogation. The young man immediately states that he intends to cooperate with the investigation and will openly tell everything. Dahmer begins his confession with memories of his early childhood. As a young schoolboy, he was already a bit strange. His behavior was influenced by complex family relationships. Jeffrey's mother was prone to voluntarily leaving her life, and his father, tired of constant quarrels, could disappear for several weeks. Once, after giving his teacher a jar of tadpoles and seeing that she rejected the gift, Dahmer poured a strong chemical into the jar and watched with delight as they perished. Later, there was an opossum that died under the house, which the boy examined with interest along with his father. It was then that an unusual hobby began. The Dahmers started collecting animal remains so that Jeffrey could dissect and carefully study them. Catherine was horrified by her son's hobby, but his father supported such an interest, pleased that the boy had finally found an activity he enjoyed. Later, while trying to live in Miami, Jeffrey fondly remembered the evenings spent with his father in the garage when he didn't feel lonely. One day, the memories overwhelmed him so much that the young man asked his father for permission to return home. In Milwaukee, Jeff moved into his grandmother's house and got a job in a meatpacking plant. It was then that he first felt an attraction to the male body, falling in love with a mannequin, which he even stole. Jeffrey's memories shift to several years later. Noticing a crowd of teenagers near a store, he chose the youngest among them and, for a few bucks and a pack of beer, convinced young Konorak to pose for some photos. At that time, Dahmer didn't want to immediately dispose of his friend. He was interested in experiments. After getting the Asian boy drunk, Jeff used a drill to alter his brain and make him more obedient. After regaining some consciousness, Konorak managed to escape the apartment and get down to the street. But due to the tranquilizer and injuries, he couldn't explain anything to the two policemen who found him in an alley. Summoning her courage, Glenda intervenes in the scuffle, arguing with the cops that this isn't the first strange incident and that the blonde's apartment needs to be checked. But unwilling to deal with a non-traditional couple and a screaming black woman, the police hand the young Asian back to his friend and leave. As soon as the police car leaves, Jeffrey finishes off his unruly friend, and Glenda once again calls emergency services, reporting strange noises from the neighboring apartment. Her complaint goes ignored once more. But let's go back to 1959, when the Dahmer family first learned of the upcoming edition. Having many psychological problems, the woman takes handfuls of pills, which greatly worries Lionel. One day, he even finds his wife naked at a bus stop in the snow. When Jeffrey became a teenager, he had a close relationship with his father. But despite this, the boy did not dare to share his strange inclinations, hoping that his attraction to girls would eventually appear, while for now, he took pleasure in fish guts. Anatomy lessons became Dahmer's favorite to the point where he started asking for work to take home. This period coincided with his parents' divorce. The boy's mother gained full custody of the younger son without even asking with whom Jeffrey would live. In the midst of sorting out their relationship, the parents missed the moment when Jeff was left home alone for several months. The boy drinks heavily, starts working out, and fantasizes every evening about closeness with other men. In an alley not far from home, Jeffrey notices a handsome runner. After learning his training schedule, the young man, armed with a bat, decides to attack, but at the last moment lacks the courage. Joyce undergoes rehabilitation after the divorce at a women's center. When she regains her composure and begins helping other women in need, the center's director offers her his position. Jeffrey's rude behavior is excused by those around him as stemming from family problems. Teachers try to support the teenager, but it seems he doesn't need it. On the way home, Jeff stops his car in front of a handsome guy who asks for a ride to the city. Agreeing, Dahmer lures him to his place, and when the guy, realizing the blonde isn't quite traditional, tries to leave, Jeffrey stops him with a barbell plate. Thus, his first murder occurred, remaining unsolved. When investigators found the hitchhiker's remains, Jeff gladly told the detectives how he had tried to dispose of them. After this incident, Jeffrey managed to suppress his desires for 9 years, although he was still only attracted to internal organs or male bodies. The young man just wanted to be a good boy and a source of pride for his parents. By that time, the boy's father had already started a new family, continuing to argue with his ex-wife. Seeing the mess Jeffrey had made, Lionel scolded his son and only then found out that the teenager had lived alone for 3 months. In a frank conversation with his father, the boy confesses that he considers himself a failure. He tries to tell the old man about his strange, intimate preferences, but Lionel avoids the conversation, not wanting to know anything. The boy is sent to Ohio University, but he doesn't last long there. As punishment for being expelled, his father sends Jeff to the army, and the men meet only a year later, at Christmas. At first glance, everything is fine for the young man there. He looks great in uniform and is no different from his comrades. No one even suspects that during the military medicine course, the soldier is recording the names of all sedatives, using which he does all sorts of things to his comrades while they're unconscious. Thus, he is also kicked out of the army, and he moves to live with his grandmother. The old woman gives the young man an iron chest, in which she keeps his father's childhood photos and family trinkets. That's when the mannequin incident occurred. Finding it in her grandson's bed, the woman first suspected Jeff of strangeness and threw the toy out, which greatly angered the young man. After the incident, Jeffrey began drinking even more. This led to Dahmer disgracing himself at the local fair, getting his first police record, and losing his job. Jeff manages to get a job as a nurse at a blood donation center, but even there he finds something to feast on. He steals bags of blood, which help him relax. The young man starts going to a nightclub for non-traditional guys, and one of his friends introduces him to the sauna's behind-the-scenes life. Jeff becomes a regular guest at the hotel until the management finds out that he's drugging guests with substances. He has to change locations, and he brings his next friend to an expensive hotel. But after mixing up the glasses, he ends up taking the substance himself, and the next morning remembers nothing, not even how his partner ended up dead. Dragging the friend's body out in a huge suitcase and hiding it in his grandmother's basement, Jeffrey Dahmer once again escaped punishment, keeping the head in a chest with the photographs as a souvenir. Jeff has a new hobby, reading obituaries in the newspapers. He goes to funerals, and afterward, he tries to obtain the bodies to lie next to them. While telling detectives about this, the young man said he wanted to control someone just as he is constantly controlled by his elders. After this, Jeff began to deliberately eliminate new acquaintances. Meeting men in bars who were into same-sex love, the young man invited them over when his grandmother was asleep, and after drugging them, dragged them into the basement where he carried out his brutal experiments. Sometimes the old woman would complain about the smell, but the young man always found excuses that didn't arouse suspicion. One day she discovered a satanic altar belonging to her grandson, and a scandal erupted in the family. But not finding anything seriously wrong, Lionel simply asked his son to behave better. One day the maniac made a mistake that could have ended his killing spree. He brought another man home, but just as he had drugged him and was about to drag him into the basement, the grandmother came downstairs to stop the madness. The old woman believed that her grandson's friend was just drunk, but she stayed with him until morning, after which she put him on a bus home. Once he regained consciousness, the rescued young man went to the police, but his skin color once again became a reason for the authorities to ignore the report. When the situation repeated itself and a young Asian boy ended up in Jeff's house, the police took a bit more action, but the judge, considering the accused's age and character, sentenced the maniac to only 1 year in prison with the right to work, charging him only with attempted non-consensual intimacy. After his release a year later, Jeffrey Dahmer did not rethink his behavior. He simply decided to move out of his grandmother's house to avoid getting caught again. In a club, Jeffrey meets Tony, a deaf gay man who dreams of settling down and finding true love. Moving to a big city, the man indeed finds his place. He gets a good job, becomes a model, and makes friends. Returning home for the weekend, Tony meets Jeff in a bar, and it seems to him that everything is perfect. This is true love. The two men go on dates, have long conversations, and discover many common interests. Jeff even abandons his initial plans and does not use drugs. When his father arrives, Dahmer cleans the apartment and declares that he has quit drinking. He even feels that his life is changing for the better. But when Tony, after spending the night together, says he needs to leave for the city, Jeff returns to his usual state and reaches for a hammer. Tony's mother contacts the police. Upon hearing that the woman is looking for her black, deaf, gay son, the police shelve her report. When the woman starts gathering volunteers to search for Tony, Jeffrey calls the Hughes family and tells them to stop looking for their missing son. For dinner, the maniac prepares his friend's heart, savoring each bite. And then there was Tracy, who finally led the police to him. The neighbors were horrified to learn how many remains were found in the young man's refrigerator next door. The police are handling the grim case, but another problem arises. Glenda loudly declares that she had contacted the cops many times for help, but was ignored because of her skin color. Detectives are tasked with visiting the families of all the identified victims to inform them of what happened. A pastor arrives in town wanting to raise issues of racial inequality, homosexuality, and law enforcement inaction. Many believe this will only lead to more unrest. Not wanting to fight alone, the priest seeks Glenda's help, and the woman finally has someone to talk to about what she had been afraid to discuss. She recalls all the strange things that happened in the blonde man's apartment. Noise, cries of pain, and stench were constant on their floor. When the new tenant disappeared, the woman immediately knew where to look for him, but the police, out of habit, brushed off Glenda's reports. The only thing they managed to achieve was issuing an eviction notice. As an apology, Jeffrey brought the neighbor a meat sandwich, not just urging, but demanding that she eat it. Fortunately, the maniac was scared off by voices in the hallway, and he left. Since then, Glenda started calling the police more often, but still with no results. Lionel is allowed to see his son, but the old man can't find the words and babbles about the weather and Grandma's health. He believes Jeffrey needs help and that if they manage to have him declared insane, he could be cured. The young man mentions their joint experiments with animals, but the father doesn't want to even think that he might be partly to blame for what happened. The man can't sleep, constantly thinking about who is to blame for his son's problems. He recalls his wife's pregnancy, their constant arguments, and even his own childhood fantasies that might have been passed on to his son. Milwaukee residents take to the streets in protest to prevent the police from covering up the case, as it's important for everyone that, in addition to the maniac, all those who turned a blind eye to the signs and complaints are punished. The two police officers who returned the young Asian boy to Jeffrey's hands are suspended from duty during the investigation. The story begins to accumulate details, including some that aren't entirely accurate. For example, an anonymous source claims to have been a close friend of Jeff's in his youth and that Jeff told him he was forced by his father. Jeff's lawyer and Lionel try to persuade him to feign insanity, but the young man refuses, hoping for the electric chair. The convict's parents, meeting in the courthouse corridor, once again shower each other with accusations. Trying to find the answer to the rhetorical question, who is to blame, the jury finds Jeffrey Dahmer sane and sentences him to 15 life sentences, one for each victim. During the trial, each of the victims' relatives had the chance to express to the young man everything they had been holding back during the investigation. Given a minute to speak his final words, Jeff repents for what he has done and asks the victims for forgiveness. Lionel also apologizes to his son, taking full responsibility for his pathological loneliness. The idea of writing a tell-all book occurs to the maniac's father. When he fully dedicates himself to work, his wife informs him that Dahmer's mother tried to end her life. The suspended police officers are reinstated. Furthermore, they are met with applause by all their white colleagues at the station. The pastor plans to fight against injustice and hold all those responsible accountable. Jeffrey finds himself in solitary confinement, but his spirits remain high. He continues to joke and feels great. He becomes even happier with fresh mail. The criminal receives dozens of letters from fans who send him words of support and money. Jeff's popularity goes to his head so much that he starts acting smug in the cafeteria. This is noticed by one of the inmates who doesn't like the newcomer's provocations. Glenda packs her things to return home. The woman is confident that she can forget what happened, but she becomes frightened as soon as she enters the apartment. Now Jeff can afford a luxury. He pays a guard to get a player and music tapes. But soon the same guard takes the gift away because Dahmer is keeping the other inmates awake. Fans don't just send letters to Dahmer. They bombard the victims' relatives with cartoons and letters containing threats and mockery. Tony's mother contacts a lawyer, but he admits that it's almost impossible to stop this. The only thing the lawyer can do is sue Lionel, who published the book. The lawyer is confident that the money from the sales should go to all the victims of the criminal, but the old man doesn't know this yet. He is proud of himself, especially after Sherry calls his book a brilliant work. Jeff learns about the book from a news report. Meanwhile, the writer himself learns that he won't receive a cent from the book sales. Konarek's family tries to return to normal life, but someone begins calling them, demanding that the immigrants go back to their homeland. These calls cause the second son to start having nightmares, in which he sees his deceased brother and Jeffrey Dahmer. The disgraced police officers receive awards for the dangerous capture of Jeffrey and for their special vigilance. In another, poorer and more modest hall, Glenda also receives an award for her services to the citizens. It's surprising. The woman believes she doesn't deserve such an honor, while the cops, who were responsible for Konarek's death, accepted their rewards without question. Konarek's family is also promised a large sum from the city if they file a lawsuit, but when the family gathers at the altar that evening, the father is convinced that no amount of money will bring his son back. Glenda continues to be plagued by nightmares, and she goes down to the first floor. There, right on the floor, her neighbors are sleeping, afraid to return to their apartments. But the idyll is shattered by the building manager. He asks everyone to disperse because the landlord has forbidden people from sleeping in the hallway. Glenda suffers from guilt, and she finds Konarek's father to ask for his forgiveness. But the old man understands that the woman is not to blame. She did everything she could. Lionel visits his mother in the hospital, who has completely lost her mind and no longer recognizes anyone. He tells her about the book and how they refused to make a movie based on it. He also asks the old woman to forgive Jeff. On the way home, Glenda encounters teenagers taking pictures of Dahmer's house. The woman's daughter can't contain herself and smashes the rude boy's camera. Returning home, the women sit down in front of the TV to watch Dahmer's interview. The entire city, hoping to understand the psychopath's motive, stops everything to tune in. Glenda's evening is ruined by a visit from the police. This time, they didn't have to be called several times. They arrest the woman's daughter for the broken camera and give her the station's address, where she'll be taken. A local businessman learns about an auction. Jeffrey Dahmer's belongings are selling like hotcakes. The old man then spends a huge sum and buys all the items to bury them in a landfill, preventing fans from turning into imitators. The immigrant family is offered a small sum, but the father has no choice, and he agrees. He also accepts an envelope from an oligarch. That evening, the man receives another threatening call, which all this time had been made by simple police officers who thought it would be funny. The building manager warns Glenda about the relocation. The city has decided to demolish the house. The woman agrees but asks that a memorial be erected on the site in memory of the victims. 2 months later, the machinery demolishes the house where the nightmare took place. Jeffrey begins attending church services as his grandmother had wanted. At one of these services, the young man is struck in the neck, but the wound is light, and in just a couple of days, Jeff is flipping through Christmas cards from fans. Chicago, 1977. A local resident, John Wayne Gacy, invites a handyman to his house to give him a construction job, slips a sedative into his drink, and attacks. A struggle unfolds in the house, but the young man fails to escape. The criminal spends many years in prison, and finally it is announced that Gacy's life sentence will be replaced by an injection. Jeffrey continues to provoke criminals and hand out autographs. Such behavior deeply offends one of the inmates, who doesn't understand why Dahmer is so arrogant. The inmate goes to the library and asks to be told about his strange neighbor. What he reads in the newspapers shocks him. Hearing about Gacy, Jeff turns to the prison chaplain. The maniac begins to worry about his soul, and he asks to be baptized so as not to end up in hell. Glenda also turns to the preacher. She confesses that she cannot forgive Dahmer, and her heart is filled with anger. She hopes that the maniac will face punishment, not only in court. During a visit with his father, Jeffrey talks about his decision, and Lionel is happy for his son and his salvation. The man tells his son that he forgives him and will always love him, no matter what. The old immigrant marries off his son and invites Glenda to the celebration. The two share their sorrows, but both understand that they will have to find a way to live on. On the day of the solar eclipse, 2 significant events occur simultaneously. At one prison, Gacy prepares to leave this life, and in another, Jeffrey prepares to be baptized. At the same time, a Christian inmate prays to God for a sign to punish Dahmer. Jeffrey joyfully emerges from the baptismal font, confident that he is now saved. From that day on, he spends all his free time with the Bible, hoping to find answers. He has to put the book aside to do some work, but this time, another inmate is sent to assist the men. When the guard leaves the gym, Jeff realizes that something bad is about to happen. He hears his friend scream, and a minute later, his main enemy appears before Dahmer. After reading a sermon about salvation and punishment, the inmate strikes Jeffrey Dahmer several times. He continues until it is clear that it is all over. Lionel is informed of what happened and is allowed to see his son one last time. The devastated father barely recognizes Jeff and bends over him to say goodbye. After the ceremony, the convict's parents are invited for a conversation and informed that a major institute is requesting Dahmer's brain for research, but Lionel refuses. He believes his son deserves peace and they should not turn him into an experiment. The court sides with the father and denies the scientists who could have uncovered the truth about the madman's health. Glenda appeals to the committee to install a memorial on the site of the demolished house. But as has been the case all along, no one hears the woman's voice. The authorities develop the neighborhood, forgetting all of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims.